Assalamu alaikum, hello, and welcome to the Voice of Islam Living History program. In today's program, we're going to look at the origins of Western culture, and this will be a two-part program. To discuss this, I'm joined by Mr. Arif Ahmad and Mr. Amjad Hussain. Welcome to both of you. I know last time we discussed the development of some of the great civilizations, how they contributed to our early understanding of history and the civilizations of antiquity. Today I want to focus more specifically on the origins of Western civilization, and let me just set the scene really for our listeners. Western civilization certainly appears at present to be the dominant and universal expression of humanity. Wherever one goes, the middle classes from countries as diverse as India, China, Russia, and Japan want to have the standard and style of life of those in the West. To an outsider or a newcomer, this civilization is defined by democracy and a free market, consumer-led society that has an almost blind faith in the process of change. It frowns upon the past and has its eyes firmly set on the future of its own making. However, Western culture is a fusion of an ancient Palestinian culture and a Greco-Roman culture. A little bit of this we touched on in the last program. Clearly, the Greeks and Romans have played a major part in shaping Western culture, and biblical Christianity and the Jewish faith also has. If I could start with Amjad initially. One of the interesting things about Western culture, and I suppose the Abrahamic faiths, the Semitic cultures, is this belief in one God, and we'll talk more about the theological developments as well. And yet, when you look in the thousands of years gone in the past, these were a small group of people who had this faith, and yet massive civilizations all around from, we talk about the early Sumerians and Assyrians and Phoenicians and Babylonians and Egyptians and so on, who believed in a variety of gods. How do you explain this surviving and those great civilizations going? You take a deep interest in history, Amjad.
Yeah, I do indeed very much. It's a passion, on a list of host of other passions as it is. Yes, is certainly the story of Western civilization is a fascination. It is fascination, and that continues to fascinate many people around the world, both lay and professionals. And of course, we tend to think that somehow history flows in a linear manner. It doesn't. Unfortunately, we like to think it does, but there is a good, fascinating connection that we make that the spring and the origin of Western civilization is a Greco-Roman. Actually, like you mentioned in your introduction, is more amalgam than that. It's Greek and Roman culture that flourished, yes, of course, and there's, as with all civilization, there is always they flourish, they rise, and there's a decline and a fall, and then of course we know that following the demise of Roman Empire, when Rome was ransacked by the Visigoths, by the Huns and the Vandals, the whole Europe fell into Dark Ages, known as the Dark Ages, and then the Middle Ages, and now we have the Renaissance and modern times, as it were. But of course, civilization never understands the thought, and the ideas never stayed static. Neither does trade. When Rome declined, certainly civilization must have flourished elsewhere. And guess what? That was from the demise of the Persian and the Roman empires, out of the desert, and this was enduring. How religions and a small minority can survive. People who believe in one God, they took over whereas there were other dominant civilizations that believed in multiple gods, and now their history.
Part of the reason I pose this question, Arif, as well, and I'll turn to you, is that quite often we're growing up in a very scientific age. And a lot of people, when they talk about evolution and biological evolution, and they throw in the sort of the Darwinian survival of the fittest, that whoever is the strongest, the fittest, they survive. in religious terms, there you are, those who believed in the one God were a really tiny minority, small group, and these massive empires we talked about. And yet they all perished. And I just wanted really to start from that point, because there was the belief in all sorts of gods, and maybe you can touch on that.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons, my own view as to why this concept or this belief in one God has endured, and even in societies today, many people may consider them godless, but if somebody does believe in God, they tend to believe in one God, is I think one God gives you some certainty. It gives you an idea that there is one creator, one universal creator, not just responsible for creating your civilization, but civilizations on other worlds. And I think when people, maybe they discarded this concept of multiple gods because it caused chaos and confusion, and which of these gods would maybe have been superior, and how could they all be gods? They would end up fighting with each other, and what sort of logic does that present? Many of the scientists, although they had scientific minds, were trying to explain how the world developed or how it evolved. They also had strong religious faith. It's not that as though Darwin didn't necessarily believe in God, or people like Newton, or even Einstein, who was fairly agnostic. But I think this idea sort of seems to coalesce around that there is one God who has created the heavens, who has created the earth, and who brings order, who can bring order in a society which might be very fragmented, because everybody looks to one God. So I think this idea, this concept has a lot of resonance with people both in the West and maybe even with people in the East.
I want to explore with both of you more deeply, really, the origins of this deep felt belief and the way it has succeeded and survived and clearly now flourished. Because when you look across, and part of this is also to do with the current sort of atheist views and criticism of religion, of how, just its mythology and shaped through airy-fairy ideas. A lot of the very early civilizations, many believed in fire gods and sea gods and all sorts of different sort of monstrous divine being, etc., and also for fertility gods. And I know you've taken a lot of interest in this. And then we move towards clearly the Greeks and Romans with the gods in the shape of men, and we'll go into that. But describe me some of the early religions, your impressions of those in these big civilizations.
If we look into before the Romans and the Greeks and the Sumerians and so on, if you look into prehistory, we get mainly shamanic culture, and that's another thing. Shamanism or shamanistic culture has always been there. So the early man, obviously, he was concerned with his safety, security, as a hunter-gatherer, and then obviously once he settled, he started contemplating the cycles of life. He obviously saw the sunrise and the sunset, and the early human thing with cultivation. When will the harvest? The crops will ripen, and so other fruit will ripen. So he was connected with the cycles of time, the equinoxes, the solstices, and so forth.
And these are common, aren't they, across all from east to west cultures, and all the different cultures?
And obviously, they've always been in the subconscious of mankind. The greater questions of all that have been always troubling us. Where we come from, who we are. The identity thing. As a species, this is not just as individuals or cultures, but as a species. We saw the animals and we domesticated them and so forth. What it is that sets us apart. So this has been, religion has always been at the forefront. It's never disappeared. It's manifested in different ways and so forth. And, in the Abrahamic tradition, it's been through the prophets and divine revelation, where mankind have been inspired, or where the prophets have been inspired and they've been teachers and guides. And then, of course, religion has been instituted through the priestly class. And, of course, civilization, as soon as the hunter-gatherers settled down, they had cities, and then obviously to maintain some sort of civic order, you had kings, you had chieftains, you had tribal chiefs, you had civic chiefs, and then if you're a country, that it was not just village huts, villages and towns, and then these great cities that sprung on the ancient rivers system, because you needed to cultivate, you needed water as a source of life, not just for the crop but the animals, and if you live in those desert conditions certainly is a life-saving thing, and the Hanging Gardens of Babylonia are very famous. So is man's association with domestication and cultivation and breeding animals and the flora and the fauna and so forth. So those are the underpinnings of civilization. So soon as we are surplus harvest because it's division of labor, and we started thinking of the greater questions, where does, the stars in the heaven are all about, the cycles, the setting of the sun and the rising and the lunar cycles and so forth. So these have always occupied mankind. So then, of course, we had the shamanic guides. These are the earliest prehistoric religions. Even in antiquity and remote antiquity, they were the guides, spiritual, the witch doctors, or the medicine men try to answer some of these very troubling questions, be they associated with personal diseases or the social evils, warfare, death, and so forth, and disease, famine, crop failure. So we looked at the heavens, we also looked at the cycles of time, the seasons, and then to the priestly class and the shamans. And obviously there's been something that's been troubling us as species, as that we find peace within us. So this has really preoccupied mankind. Even in the darkest hour, I'm sure people, not guided by the prophets, they would have looked to their, shamanic priestly classes, them humming and being intoxicated by different fumes and medication, and they try to, unravel some of these mysteries.
I'm going to deal with the sort of biblical traditions and also touch on the Quran, but I find it quite fascinating, don't you, how many of these civilizations turn to a variety of gods, whether it's the bull figure features in a lot of archaeology as a key player, and then eagles and whatever. And how do you think, is it just man's imagination, Arif? What do you think, or what's your reading of your history teachers?
What I believe is that obviously man realizes that he's here for a purpose, and he's trying to make sense of his life. And when man was not spiritually developed, they obviously were looking at things which were powerful. So they were looking at things which would sustain them, as Amjad Saab was saying. And they would look at something powerful like the sun, and they would realize that the sun was needed to be able to grow things. The sun was needed for heat. And when the sun disappeared, they were worried whether the sun was going to come back.
So that's why the sun god features so strongly throughout all the different cultures.
So you can, although it's maybe looking back, you can sort of say, well, why did you worship the sun? At the time, it made sense to the people who saw the sun disappear and wanted it to come back the next day and make sure that they would be alive the next day. Likewise with these powerful beings, whether it's bulls or other animals which have capabilities stronger than man, they would see these as a sign of strength, and that might be something that they might want to emulate. So which person hasn't thought that it would be nice if man could fly, and they would see something that would be able to fly as something more powerful or something that they would aspire to be. And in some cases, obviously, they would take this as something that they would then want to worship. Likewise with a bull character. Bull character is obviously very strong, a strong character, and something that, again, man naturally might want to aspire to be like. But I think that as man developed spiritually, and as men began to understand the world and actually use these powers to harness for his own good, it realized that actually man was actually more powerful than these, or more developed than these. So now we understand how the sun works, and we actually harness the power of the sun, whether it's growing crops, whether it's using it for solar energy, whatever it might be. We actually understand that now. And so now that we are more developed in terms of our scientific development, as well as spiritually, we realize that the sun is not a god. We realize that there is a higher being there. So I think this was just part of the development of man, part of the development almost of religion, in that man started as an infant. When you try and introduce, when you have a child, you cannot introduce very complicated concepts to them. And they will see small things and they will be amazed by them.
I mean, clearly based on the knowledge and information that we have, for us, we're able to see more logically. But it must have been quite a challenge to the early sort of, Jewish tribes tribes, etc., that were trying to explain this concept. I mean, I'm going to go into a little bit about Genesis and Adam and all the different ideologies, but it must have been very difficult for them to explain to all these great civilizations who believed in them, don't you think? I mean, it must have been a real challenge at that stage to say, no, there's an unseen one God somewhere.
Well, it is, like Arif has just alluded to, the primitive man in his, elements in that setting, before, it was hunter-gatherer, before this advent of civilization, as we call it. Civilization being settled, settled man, not a nomadic culture. Obviously, that we passed on, then subsequently we brought that into when we settled down, through oral traditions, these prehistoric gods came into those cultures, and those cultures took on them and developed them, and so forth, because, it's, why upset existing order as it is, you need stability, you need continuity, and, you can't teach new, these new tricks to new people, can you? So it's like the stories that have been passed on, from generations father, to son and so forth, the oral tradition. I'm sure some of these politicians would have been amused to find so many gods, but they, I think, being politicians that they are, they rather ride the currents than introduce new ideas. And we know what happened to Akhenaten when he introduced only one god, what kind of people he brought to Egypt.
Yes, I mean, it's interesting how the different themes develop in religion. So when we look at clearly the Quranic traditions and the biblical traditions, and a lot of the story centers around Adam early on as the sort of early development of mankind, and the story then builds up from Adam's children and then Noah and the prophets and the floods and Abraham and so on, and the story builds. But if you look at the Genesis account in the Old Testament, for example, which tries to set how man came to be or how creation came to be, in a sense, there's quite an interesting discussion in there, in that there's two separate accounts. What are your thoughts about? Do you want to go first, Arif, or Amjad?
Well, Genesis, because all religions and cultures, and the Hebrew culture, obviously, there is certain vocabulary all religions use. They try to convey both physical and metaphysical meaning. So I think, just like I'll just highlight this, to a later period where Jesus' parables. If you look at parables, they should be taken as a parable, as a story, and the narrative is not meant to be taken literally. And I think that the same theme should be applied to that of the Genesis. You see, it tries to give an interpretation of events that we obviously do not know what happened. I mean, we can use modern physics, chemistry, and the knowledge that we have gained today, and we can go at length. Now we know, the solar systems and so on are created in the supernovae. But there was darkness.
In those days, they didn't have astronomy of the same.
Yeah, we didn't have access to telescopes or these powerful machines that we have today. So something had to be taught to the primitive man. So it was couched in such a language, in vocabulary, in symbolism, in parables, in similitudes, and I think that's very important to bear in mind.
That's
so
a good point.
We should not, take a literal meaning of the Torah, because we really get ourselves into trouble.
Arif, you want to?
Yes, I think, and I agree very much with what Amjad Sab said, but again, this is about trying to make things understandable to people. So if man is spiritually undeveloped or still very primitive, putting it in simple terms helps him to understand. But I completely agree that, to take that literally, to say, for example, that the world was created in 7 days, it's, with the greatest respect, but it's a nice story. But anybody in this day and age that believes that the world could have been created in 7 days, it doesn't really bear out any sort of reality. But the Genesis account, I believe, was an attempt to show how creation might have started, how it might have evolved, and basically the underlying message was to show that God created everything. So if you have that fundamental basic belief that God is the creator of everything, then you have to look at how the world was created. So I think that, yes, if you take the accounts of Genesis or other scriptures too literally, then I think you're only going to get a very, very superficial and basic understanding and not the deeper meaning that was meant. So you have to sort of put the two together. You have to look with your reason and with your eyes and with the scientific scientific evidence and the information which is out there, and which is very, very conclusive, you can say. But then you also have to look at what these scriptures are telling you, and they are all coming up with a fairly consistent message that God, or the God that you believe in, has created everything. And you have to look at these, I think, in parallel to basically try and make a fuller understanding of what's going on. Because if you take the literal interpretation, then it only gets you so far, and it doesn't really help you to develop. It doesn't really help you to understand really what has gone on in reality.
I think the interesting thing about it is that most of the things that we learnt early on were from the biblical accounts of how history was seen. And then you had obviously the Greek historians and the Roman historians also from there. And there was a degree of, mythology, etc. But clearly these two accounts have provided a lot of things. And then later on, after the European Enlightenment and with archaeology and scientific development, we obviously know a lot more. But one of the interesting things, the reason I picked the Genesis account, is it shows how history, religion, faith have an interaction with each other. Because if you look at the Genesis accounts, there are two separate accounts in that. One is clearly based on, if you believe in God's account of how he tries to guide you and show you, and as you say, metaphorically, and similitudes and sort of analogies that God gives. But then other people then in turn try to fit it into the logic of that civilization, that time and whatever. And so when you look at the two accounts, you can see how one account has been clearly influenced by the great civilizations of that time and how they viewed it and its development, and another account that's tried to keep the same sort of theme as it was given to the original prophets or whatever. But let's move on a little bit. And clearly our understanding of early history then is based on the Bible. And so you see Genesis, you see Prophet Noah and the flood and whatever. How does history see some of these things? Because clearly the current scientists have some problems with some of the accounts and how they... But in relation to the flood, I have read in a number of different accounts that there are cultures throughout the world that talk about the flood. Amjad, what do you think?
Yes, a common it's a common motif of the flood motif that runs through all cultures and all civilizations. So it must have been some sort of a global cataclysm. Scientists are now trying to envisage and put some sort of handle to it, some sort of logical thing in the whole thing in scientific perspective. They look at the melting of the last ice age, going from the Paleocene into the present epoch of time, and the event that happened is basically and the 9,600 watershed mark where the major ice caps receded, that resulted in deluge all over the world. So we see that the present shorelines, they would have been at least 2 miles out, 9,600 years ago, and subsequently there was a massive rise of water. So many of the ancient civilizations that were on the former shorelines, they have been deluged and submerged. So the survivors of that deluge then carried these oral traditions and passed them on. So they are, we find them in the Epic of Gilgamesh, and he's the hero of the Epic of Gilgamesh is a certain person who survives that deluge, which the Bible, the Torah, and the Quran calls Noah. The pickup. So is Noah, but other Mayans have the same culture, and the Indian civilization has similar themes, and the Chinese also have, and the Japanese. So the flood motif is
I raise this because
is a common theme that runs, is a common thread that runs across all cultures.
Arif?
Yes, I just wanted to say something about the concept of the flood. Even in recent times, even in the last few days, we've seen floods in the UK. And it's often seen as a sort of a punishment. Some people might say it's a divine punishment, or it's a reminder of the power of God and how, you might have a house and the next day it can be washed away. Even a few years ago when there was the tsunami, we saw the destruction that caused. So the event or the episode of the flood is very plausible as a reminder to people about the power of God, about how things are out of their control, and how they also do need to take care of what they're doing, both physically in terms of preparing for such events, and also recognizing their master. Because if these floods are seen as a punishment, it means that maybe they're not doing something right. So I think this powerful destruction of floods is still as relevant today as it was as whenever it
I raise it because this is a history program rather than a theology program. I raise it because I think it throws up some interesting questions from a historical perspective and research of, the time scales we are still learning about humanity's development and the key marks, etc. But it does something that features outside the religious accounts as well, and for historians to know. But moving on, as I say, the group of people that are quite keen to look at is the sort of Semitic people living in that area, the Jewish tribes, etc. And clearly, they believe that there is a creator, God helping them or whatever. So, out of your faith, you believe that, or whether your historical records are showing. But one thing is quite clear, that these people seem to go through some very difficult times during their the development of their civilizations. The classic one, the big ones, are the bondage, suffering under other civilizations. And, just in relation to the time they have in Babylon and all the Old Testament prophets. I know, Amjad, you've read into it more. Share with us a little bit of the difficulties.
Well, basically, the whole narrative is basically based on the persecution of people, not just the Jewish people, but as a faith and, of course, of ideas. So, original focus is on Abraham and his struggles with Nimrod, the king of Babylon. So, probably Abraham had some unique ideas, socio-political, theological, philosophical ideas that did not fit into the mainstream ideas of the king or the Babylonian civilization. He probably had some emergent ideas, new novel thoughts. We continue, like we have the Higgs boson and the new discoveries that are happening. Can you imagine? So old science becomes redundant. There was a massive revolution from Newtonian mechanics to relativity that explained so much phenomena, gravity and so forth. So we shifted from Newtonian ideas to Einsteinian ideas, and now in the 21st century, we are trying to connect the cosmic with the quantum, as it were, the micro with the macro. So there has been a constant evolution of shift of ideas, be in the scientific realm, socio-political thought as well. There's been enormous revolutionary ideas. So one can imagine when a new person comes along on the scene and with new ideas, going back in time, it would have been such an upheaval for that society. So you can imagine the antagonism Abraham as a patriarch, he had from the establishment, as it were. So he had to flee his town. So this whole story of Semitic people is one of persecution at the hand of a state and very powerful figures, and they've always been minorities. So this story of suffering is a story of actually endurance as well, and a human struggle. That it's the struggle of the spirit, keeping that same spirit and ideas, be it theological ideas, be it political ideas, be it social ideas, keeping them alive. But of course, it was the reforming, taking man from multiple gods and turning him into one god. So this has been obviously, you can imagine, we alluded to that the prehistoric man had all sorts of gods, multitudes of gods, shamanic priests, sun gods, moon gods, animal gods. And then having these novel ideas, and the king god as well, mind you, because the king, the Egyptian pharaoh or the Babylonian king was a king priest. So this is a story of that struggle, basically.
Let's have a break at this stage, and then we'll pick up from there again. So welcome back. Before the break, we were talking about how the Semitic tradition really came to us in the West, and how the belief in one God, in spite of the many civilizations that believed in so many other gods, etc. We touched on some major developments like the Adam story and the flood, but the central figure is Abraham, isn't he, really? Tell us a little bit, Amjad, about how Abraham, he obviously was in Ur, which is part of Mesopotamia.
Mesopotamia, yes, the ancient Babylonian city, and is But again, it's a story of persecution and the patriarch fleeing Babylonia. Initially goes north, and settles in Nineveh, then migrates westward. And apparently under orders from the Lord that he should settle in the land of the Philistines, or as then it was known as the Canaanite, was inhabited by Canaanites. And he settles there with his family. Then there is famine in Canaan, and he goes southwards to the Nile Delta to get grain for his family. And there he meets a beautiful princess whom the Jews called as a handmaiden to Sarah. But actually she is now, historiography and other data proves that she was an Egyptian princess. So he marries a Babylonian princess, which is Sarah, from his own family, from the tribe of the Chaldees, and he marries an Egyptian princess. So here, intertwining of two cultures, the Semitic Babylonian and the Egyptian. And from the Egyptian wife, he begets obviously Ismail alayhi salam, and from the Babylonian wife, Isaac.
So he comes back then back to...
he comes back to and settles in Hebron, present-day Al-Khalil, where we find the tomb of the patriarch Abraham and Rebecca and Sarah, in the cave of the patriarchs, on which the Muslims built a mosque called the Mosque of Abraham, or the Al-Khalil, which is now, of course, is a contested. It's an Arab town, Muslim town, but after the Yom Kippur War, it was taken over by Israel, and now the mosque is divided between the Jewish quarter and the Muslim quarter. So it's.
But just going back to Abraham, he settles back, and then we have the story up to Jacob.
Of course. Then obviously. The jealousy of Sarah, Hagar and Ishmael is cast out. They settle in the land of Paran according to the Torah, which is Arabian Peninsula, and that we know the story on that. And Isaac then marries is it Rebecca? Yeah, and then he begets Esau and Jacob, and Jacob inherits the blessing. He becomes a prophet, has 12 sons. We have.
And this is the interesting. So I want Arif to pick up.
Arif to pick on that.
He have 12 sons who bicker and quarrel about lots of different things. But I'm particularly interested in the story of Joseph.
Yes. Well, I think one thing, first of all, that's worth mentioning is Abraham is universally respected in all of the major religions of the world. But the story of Joseph, even if you're not a religious person, it's something that you probably will have studied in school. You may have seen the play, Joseph the Technicolor Dreamcoat. But of course, there is a more serious story behind this about how Joseph, or Hazrat Yusuf is called in the Muslim tradition, was the most favourite of the sons. But the other brothers were obviously very jealous of him and cast him out. The story goes
threw him in the well. It was nasty. It was nasty.
Yeah. And told the father that he was dead. They got his shirt and they put the blood of a bird on the shirt and took him back to the father, and the father obviously was absolutely distraught. But that was just the beginning of the adventure, if you want to call it. For
God
Joseph.
Saves those he loves.
Absolutely. And of course, Joseph, as we know, suffered many trials and tribulations, going to Egypt and eventually through jail and being a good interpreter of dreams, became obviously basically one of the right-hand men in terms of being a governor, and helped the situation when there was famine in terms of making good the provisions.
I mean, his story is quite amazing, isn't it? How he rose to power, and also his moral compass and how righteous he was.
Absolutely, and everybody around him obviously respected him. I could see that he was not the criminal or the thing that people might have portrayed him for. And also he was unique in terms of his forgivingness. And when he did meet his brothers, although they didn't recognize him, he recognized them straight away, and was, although he obviously led them on a little bit and toyed with them, you could say, obviously he forgave them, and obviously was reunited with them, and also with his brother Benjamin as well, and eventually also the rest of his family. So it is a great story of triumph.
So where do things go bad for the Jewish tribes then, Amjad? Because obviously he was at height. I assume his brothers came back to Canaan, but then, you go up to the story of Moses and the bondage and the suffering and whatever.
Well, from Joseph onwards, Joseph became vizier, the right-hand man, as Arif alluded to, and his family, his tribe. tribe of Joseph settled in Egypt, and they flourished. And of course, their fortunes turned. And we have the story in the Quran, the family of Ali Imran. There's a story of the struggle of the family of Moses. Al Imran is Amran, as in the Bible. Amran is the father of Moses and Aaron, Arun alayhi salam, and they have a sister as well called Maryam, and it is the sister that costs the Moses in basket, and
that's right. He gets to be brought up
in the house of as an Egyptian prince, and then obviously falls out with the establishment and becomes a nomadic person, because having killed an Egyptian, he fears that there be retribution. But he meets Prophet Shuaib, Prophet Jethro, and he marries one of the shepherd girls. And of course, Prophet Jethro is descendant of Ishmael, so in a way he connects with his Semitic family again, his cousins, and Prophet Jethro is a Midianite. Midian is one of the descendants from Jacob has 12 sons and Ishmael has 12 sons, and this is prophecy in the Torah. The Torah says when Hagar is cast out of the jealousy, she's crying and upset, and she prays to the Lord. And the Lord says to Hagar, and this is actually in the Torah and in the Bible and the Genesis, that Hagar, don't be upset. Don't be upset. Look at the stars. I will multiply you thy exceedingly, and I will make you a great nation.
Yeah, it's interesting, and we will touch upon those great nations.
Your offspring will inherit the Arabah for everlasting possession, and those are the words of the Torah. So if people now lay claim to the desert, that claim is given to the firstborn of Abraham, and it's a prophecy that is, despite 1,000 years of rabbinical editing, nobody's been able to edit that out. So if somebody claims that they have a title deeds to the desert, well, God, gave the promised land and all the dwellings to the children of Hagar because of our jealousy of Sarah. So I do not know when people, I don't think so. God was meant to be, gives geographical, land deeds to anyone. It was about the kingdom of heaven that one should inherit, and it's about spirituality. But nevertheless, geographical claims can also be settled by the Torah. People, and despite that, is also the rabbinical law that the first child inherits the father. And this is not a law by the Arabs or the Jews. It's a rabbinical law, an ancient law, a birthright. And Ishmael never sold his birthright. And that's the spin if one likes it, but it comes from the Torah, it doesn't come from me.
But moving on from the sort of Israelite culture and time, clearly Moses took the Israelites to the promised land. Eventually he died, unfortunately, before we could finally settle up there, but clearly the Jews became established in the promised land in Palestine, Israel, whatever we want to call it. And it led to some great developments, King David, Prophet David, as we want to call it. But again, bad times came and the suffering started. And Amjad, perhaps you could carry on because they went into bondage again. What happened?
Yeah, that was very unfortunate because the Jews, they were divided among various nations. Of course, there were 12 tribes to begin with, had a united king. And then there was Judea and Samaria, as now we hear, the northern state and the southern state in Palestine. Two different kings, descendants from the 12 tribes. And disunity, internal warfare, and obviously a divided house is a weak house. So the Babylonians took their chances, pounced on it, and they ransacked the temple. And the Ark of the Covenant disappeared, and the Jews and the 12 tribes and the prominent figures of the Jewish civic leaders and spiritual leaders were taken as prisoners and taken back to Babylonia and held in bondage until Prophet Daniel had a dream. Prophet Daniel alayhi salam, as in the Islamic tradition, that he envisaged a ram, two-horned ram coming from the east to rescue them. And that was the writing on the wall, warning to the Babylonian kings. But obviously they did not heed it. Prophet Daniel went up to them and he demanded that the Israelites be set free, but the Babylonians would pay no heed to it. So hence the retribution. And we now know that as in the Islamic tradition and the Jewish tradition, it was Darius the Great, or known as Cyrus the Great, or Darush, mentioned in the Quran as Dhul Qarnain, and righteous and pious the pious servant of the Lord who delivered the Jews. So I know there's a bit of antagonism between Israel and Iran today, but it was Iranians, Iranians who rescued Jews from Babylonian bondage. So there is that. Unfortunately, history has a very strange
But a lot of the
twisted.
very Orthodox Jews really are very appreciative, aren't they? Still, even to this day, of this contribution to saving the Jewish culture and
Oh, absolutely. And
freeing them.
all the 12 tribes never went back to Israel or to Palestine. Some of them were dispersed. They settled in the ancient Persian Empire, of which India and Kashmir belonged to as well. So they settled in the Indus Valley, in the fertile Kashmir region. And we have, to this day, the Yusufzai tribe. They claim descent in Afghanistan and Pakistan, that they're descendants of the tribe of Joseph. That's what Yusufzai. And obviously, the name is made famous by Malala Yousafzai. She happens to be a child that.
So I want to turn now, because this program is about the origins of Western culture. We focus quite a lot on our links to the old biblical teachings, biblical culture, etc. But the other bit that's really influenced the West so much is clearly the Greek-Roman culture. So let's start off with the Greek. And in the first program, we dealt quite nicely how the mythology goes of Zeus, dressing up as a bull. And it was quite flowery language, wasn't it? But the reality was that the Greek culture really learned from the Middle Eastern cultures and built up and developed over time. But I want you to help us, because one of the fascinating things about the Greeks was they managed to change theology quite significantly, leaving aside the one God culture of the Jews and Jewish. Most of the others believed in multitudes and lots of different funny gods and earth gods and so on. But the Greeks, for the first time, brought in men-like gods, gods with great powers, but like men. So take us through.
Well, we in the prelude to this, in our first session, we alluded to that gods, different cultures are different gods, but actually no civilization springs on its own. So the Greeks developed on the Phoenician, the Minoan, and the culture from Crete and the Egyptians.
Right.
It's just that when these things are in Hellenic culture, the Egyptian gods, the Sumerian gods, the Akkadian gods, the Hittite gods, the Phoenician and the Minoan gods take on new shapes and forms, be it human and hybrid. So we get a strange mixture and pantheons of gods, you see, that reside, on Mount Apollo, Mount Olympus. Sorry, I beg your pardon. And of course, Apollo being one of the gods. Sorry, I beg your pardon. Yes. And they reside on Mount Olympus, and they descend and they take on different shapes and forms, and they seduce women. Sometimes they adopt the form of a swan, and Lydia, and she begets a son that is Hercules. And of course,
there's
another
all
time,
sorts of weird and wonderful mythologies.
Yes, of course. So there is a strange twist, and we get the heroes and the demagogues and so on, and the labors of Hercules and so forth, and then of course these gods have ultra egos, their other half as well, twin brother, the gods of the underworld.
They keep in touch with nature, don't they? The god of thunder, thunderbolts,
and the thunderbolts,
and
yes,
fire and fuse.
So we get Hades, the god of the underworld and so on, the god of punishment and so forth, and god of the seas. So again we have the Egyptian gods, the sun gods and the rain gods, and again the same thing, Babylonian and all these gods, just that they take on new forms. But of course the Greeks developed on these things, and then towards the end we have the Greeks interacting with the Egyptian culture itself, and they become the pharaohs in the form of the Ptolemies, North Africa, Egypt.
A lot of what we know about Greek culture comes from Homer's two epic poems, which is the Iliad and Odyssey. And those of us again who watch Hollywood types will have seen Troy and many other. I remember as a child when I came over from Pakistan, there was another about the fleece. What was it called?
Jason and the Argonauts.
They were weird and wonderful mythology stories, but it's interesting, and there's a lot of philosophy in those two epic poems. One would say they're equivalent to the Bible for the Greek culture.
You mentioned Jason and the Argonauts.
Yeah.
In Search of the Golden Fleece is basically similar in theme to the great hero in the Epic of Gilgamesh.
Absolutely,
and it's basically a Greek spin on an even more remote myth, which is basically a Sumerian and Babylonian story, really. So now scholars know about this, and I think our listeners, if they want to bemuse themselves, they can check this up.
I mean, one of the things,
Arif,
I don't know, Chief, but when I came and I was 9 from Kashmir, and it's like nowadays, everything is Marvel, isn't it? Superheroes. But it's fascinating mythology, don't you think?
Without a doubt. I mean, I'm from that generation as well. Things like Sinbad and Jason and the Argonauts, these were marvelous things. And the sort of the special effects, although very primitive, it was amazing to watch. So, again, these sorts of things may have been bewitching, or maybe people trying to find and understand that people had these sorts of mythological powers and they could create influence over people. So but again, it comes down to being quite superficial. It's not really it doesn't really a deep and full understanding of how the world works. But they like to see people who are powerful, who maybe can do things which they themselves could not do.
There's a lot of focus, wasn't there, on physique and power and beauty. I mean, when you see the sculpturing and the art as well, and it goes back to essentially Greek times that Western culture has adopted.
Yes,
now.
Absolutely. We can even see it in today's society where, somebody who is strong or muscle bound, whether it's in an action film or whether it's in your daily life, or beauty is very much praised. And I did see something quite interesting a few days ago. The new Star Wars film, which many of our listeners will have maybe watched by now. One of the characters from there, Princess Leia, was saying that youth and beauty are not necessarily achievements. These are just attributes they have. But these sorts of attributes of youth and beauty and strength or superpowers are a recurring theme whenever it applies to God, because this is seen as something which is superhuman, or something which maybe people want to aspire to, and they think that if people have these in plentiful supply, that they are above the normal human beings, or they are almost godlike. So I do think that this is a recurring theme which even exists to this day, that if somebody has this, and they will always have very beautiful blue eyes, blonde hair, all these sorts of things. This is where these sorts of things started to develop. And I think that legacy is still very much around today.
I think probably the biggest and most important contribution they made was through their philosophers. Household names everywhere in every culture, but in particular Western culture. Well, what do you think?
Well, they've influenced thought in the Near East as well. Actually, Plato,
Socrates before him,
Plato, and not just in philosophy, mathematics. With Pythagoreans, and also, of course, in metaphysics, we got Plotinus and Proclus. They influence, and actually, they developed much of this on the back of Chaldean, Sumerian, Babylonian, and Elamite, and the Persian. So there has been a fusion. So each successive civilization has built upon the previous, took on the mental and refined those ideas. Actually, the theorem of Pythagoras, now we know, the scholars know, the modern scholars, that it actually belongs to a lot more, has a lot more antiquity before Pythagoras got it, in his academy. But of course, they attribute it to him now because the original has been lost. Because we find Pythagorean in megalithic, architecture that still survives to this day. So obviously Pythagoras is a lot older than is attributed to him. In practicality, as it were. But obviously it's attributed to him today. But again, this is the story of civilization as it is. Ideas get developed and flourish. Even if there's a little spring of thought, a little bud, it blossoms elsewhere in another civilization. As has been, Greek culture has been lost to Europe for a long time because of the Dark Ages, and guess what? It flourished in the East, in the Islamic heartlands.
Of course, we'll
they
come
took
to
it to
that
new heights, and obviously that's a subject and story in its own right. And so what we say is that, of course, the people of the desert did not just overnight have new ideas. They also took ideas from the East, from India, from China, from Egypt, from Greco-Roman culture, and refined it into a new product and ideas. And so were the Greeks and the Romans before them. They developed ideas from the previous generations and previous civilizations. That's how the story of civilization actually works.
Sure. I mean, one of the things about the Greek culture is, apart from the philosopher, whatever, they produced a great great leader as well. And, no better great leader than Alexander the Great, clearly, who unified much of Greece, because Athens and Sparta were always loggerheads at each other.
No, they never got on.
They never got on. They were always fighting, whatever. And so they had some great warriors and some great thinkers and whatever, but they were not very big. And when Cyrus the Great was around, he used to teach them a lesson. But clearly, when he passed away, the Persian Empire probably was on a decline already. And then Alexander the Great came and he just swept,
he walked into their shoes, basically. Actually, basically there was an empire already there, so he used the established structure, the established armies, and the Persian legions. So when he defeated King Darius II in the Near East, he basically took on, he amalgamated some of the Persian soldiers who were on AWOL soldiers, you can say. They were no longer needed by the Persians, or they were disheartened with the Persian culture, and he assimilated them. So basically, you cannot conquer new territory until you assimilate its inhabitants. And Alexander was very good at that. He used politics, and he used some of the rebels, who have been suffering under the Persian yoke to his advantage. So that's why he had an easy ride. So he didn't have it all his ways. But what happened was, as with all Greek tragedies, Alexander's great empire succumbed to those great Greek tragedies. He was basically struck by an arrow when he tried to invade India. He went as far as the Jhelum, but that's where he met his demise. He met his match. It was the Malis of Multan, the present-day city of Multan in Punjab, and that he encountered fierce warriors known as the Malis. And when he laid a siege, the defenders they fought back, and he was fatally wounded by a poison arrow, and I think that's what caused his demise. And eventually, the hearse took his demise to present-day Alexandria, where he was buried. And that's
I think this period of human history is so interesting. I was going to try to cramp this program into one, but I'm thinking increasingly we will have to do it over two, because there's so much more to cover before we really look at even the impact of Christianity and how we came to be. So I was going to try to rush through, but I don't think we would do it justice. So and one of the interesting things is, Alexander, I think in such a short time, he conquered an amazing amount of land. And as you say, when he passed away, but the interesting thing is his knockback was from the Indus, wasn't it? From our part of the world.
His empire fell apart as quickly as as rapidly as it expanded, as rapidly, it succumbed and crumbled. So it was very short-lived, really. But the legacy has been everlasting. It's because when you move into new lands, you take new ideas, and he settled what is known as the Kaifars now in the Pamirs and in the Hindu Kush region. And there are Greek communities that still survive, regardless of time. And they are Greeks can be found as far as India today. As well as Pakistan, and they inhabit some of the higher lands in Afghanistan and the Persian mountains.
Well, I'm going to try to wrap this program up now, but in the next one, we will cover the Roman Empire, the impact that it had, and how Christianity got introduced to the Roman Empire, and how we eventually ended up here, where we're sitting as well. So, listen, I really want to thank both of you for such an exciting, interesting program. I think 1 hour goes past so quickly. And I hope listeners have found this program interesting and informative and useful. Until next time, goodbye.